DevOps Automation with Jeremy Likness.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your humble host. Make sure to check out www.azuredevops.show for the past episodes and show notes. And we are well into 2020, and it is a fantastic year so far. The software industry is just going like gangbusters, and we have had already just a great group of guests on the show so far in 2020, and some very, very interesting ones lined up. And today's guest is really exciting. Jeremy Likness is our guest, and he's an internationally selling author, keynote speaker, and professional coder with a personal mission to empower developers to be their best. And he has worked on commercial enterprise software for 25 years and specializes in web technology. And Jeremy is a cloud advocate for Microsoft and lives with his wife, parrot, and German Shepherd near Seattle, Washington. But in his free time, he enjoys running, hiking, and shooting 9-ball and one pocket. And Jeremy, welcome to the show. I've got to ask, what's 9-ball and one pocket?
So nine ball is just the 9-ball pool game. So it's 9 balls hit in rotation. It's a fast and furious, fun game. So unlike 8-ball, where you can just kind of pick solids or stripes, with 9-ball, you have to hit the balls in numerical order. But anytime you make the 9-ball, you can win. So it's a game that has a little bit of luck factored in. And it's probably the polar opposite of one pocket. One pocket is a game where you pick one corner pocket and then your opponent picks another, and the first one to make the most balls in their pocket wins. But it's a very strategic game. I've seen games last 2 hours because people are playing safe and just moving the pieces of the board, so to speak, being very cautious and conservative.
Okay, so you've got the running, the hiking outdoors, and then the pool games indoors.
You're right. That's the only sport I follow. That's why I love it. I just came back from London. And on London in the US, if I ask someone, if I flip through and try to find a pool game, it's almost impossible, right? I can go to YouTube. But you go to London and you flip through a channel, and it's major news coverage of these snooker tournaments that they're having over there. And I love it.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. Well, hey, let's talk some DevOps. There's some people that have seen you at various conferences, speaking engagements. But for those not familiar with your work, what's your background been, and how has your career progressed that you're now a cloud advocate at Microsoft?
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. I started out the first part of my career working for software companies. I worked for a supply chain management company in Atlanta. I started when they were a private company, was with them through their public IPO. And beyond that, I also was the third employee at a small company that grew up to be a mobile device management company. Later sold to VMware for $1.5 billion, but I didn't stick around long enough to party on that, or this conversation might be quite different. But at the end of the day, so I've always been interested in reducing human error. The less human intervention you can, the more automation, I feel, the better the process can be. But we haven't always had these nice solutions that are easy to piece together like we have today. And I'm thankful for having been in the industry so long that I had to spend the time really in my product companies going through a very manual process of automation, of writing the software that does the builds, that copies the build artifacts, that moves them into the environments, applies the database upgrades. So having done that as a very intentional, almost building software to build software, and then moving into starting to use tooling. And that transition really happened. I left the product world and moved into the consulting world and was in consulting for almost a decade. And a lot of the projects we were on, one of the first things we would establish is this idea of automation on the project. And I can still remember there was a customer who had a very old legacy application. It was written in C++. It used an object-oriented database from the 90s. And this person had maintained it over time. It ran pretty much their whole business. And they recognized that to be able to scale and bring on developers to support the tool, they need to modernize it. And so they had invested in a consulting company to come in and do that effort and spent a lot of money. And it was one of these projects where that particular company went off for several months, disappeared, came back and said, hey, we think this is what you want. And it wasn't. And so they had a very terrible experience with that. So when they came to us, they were very cautious. You know, we've already been burned once. How do we know we're not going to be burned again?
Right.
And the thing that we proposed to them was that we automate what's going to happen, and we do it immediately, so that the promise was 2 weeks into the engagement, we'd have a working piece of software. Wouldn't be their entire business from decades migrated, but it'd be a functional piece of software. And we said, you know, what's the biggest challenge? What's the one thing that you have the most doubt that can be accomplished on this new system? And it turned out there is a algorithm that took several minutes to run on the old system that was predicting output from various units. And he was very concerned about the ability to translate that and get those results. So we basically did a phase of building the migration script from that old object-oriented database to it was Azure SQL that we were moving them to. And then we immediately did a phase of building that feature that performed that computation. And the computation using some optimized SQL queries took about 2 seconds compared to the 2 minutes that the old system, and it checked all the boxes to precision. And he was sold right there. And we had only accomplished 1% of the effort. But that ability to get something out in front early on and to automate, you know, I talk about a lot of times people will approach a project and look at migration as this big step at the end. Mm-hmm. We were migrating continuously. So it wasn't just continuous delivery of software. It was automated migration of the database with every version, so that at the end of the day, when they went to flip over to the new version, there wasn't this big bang step. It was just flipping a switch.
Perfect. Well, that's awesome. And now at your work at Microsoft, what does cloud advocate mean?
It's I get asked that question a lot, and I like to think of it as 3 C's. The first is creating and curating content for developers. The second is community, connecting with the developer community. And the third is connecting with engineering back at Microsoft. So the idea is I advocate for developers, right? I can just flip the term on in, but what does that mean? It means I'm not here to sell tool X, Y, or Z. I'm here to help developers remove roadblocks and have the best experience possible. And if that means they're going with another product and they're looking to integrate with our tools and technologies, then that's what the focus is. The focus may be, we really want to use this tool, but we need it to do X, Y, and Z, and understanding the magnitude and the importance of that and bringing that back to the engineering team. But it's really a multi-directional. You know, I work closely with our product teams as they have new features. I help them get those features out to the developer community so they know what's available. I help build, sample projects. I help put together talks that illustrate ways to use products. But more importantly, when I'm out there at a conference or I'm out there at a user group meeting or I'm out there at a customer site, I'm taking feedback and understanding what the pain points are and helping articulate, track, manage those, and bring those back to the mothership, so to speak.
Okay, awesome. So one of the things that you talked a lot about in all kinds of different frameworks is DevOps automation. And you mentioned, and even before Microsoft, setting that up first and getting to the point where you can just go fast. Let's talk about, before we get into tools, you have a philosophy on just starting a project, and you mentioned a few of those things. And so is there just rules of thumb that every .NET developer should keep in mind when starting a new application?
There's a lot, and I could dig into that. But my philosophy has definitely changed and morphed over time. Just to give you an example, I used to be one of those developers who would try to write phenomenal code and thought of testing as someone else's problem. So there was definitely a time period of that. And then I was on certain projects where the importance of testing was brought to the foreground. And then I started to recognize that writing tests up front actually changes the way I think and approach the architecture of an application and improves the application overall. So I started integrating that into it. But my philosophy, especially on big projects, on smaller projects, I try to do this too, but on most projects, is don't save the stuff that feels like the big overarching infrastructure concerns until the end. Tackle those in the beginning. So when I do, I'll just give you an example. I'm building a reference application for a talk I'm giving in 2 weeks. It's a pure JavaScript application, and it's just so that I can pull it up on the screen and present some information for that conference. But I have an automated deployment of this application already in place. And by doing that up front, then it saves me any complication of trying to figure things out on the back end, and it becomes iterative. Like I may add some new set of artifacts that needs to be a part of that build, and now it's just adding those on as opposed to building this huge pipeline. So I think the idea is when you start your code base, don't try to build the thing. Try to build enough of the thing that you can have something tangible to interact with. Automate the build for the thing. If you're just doing F5 builds on your desktop, that's not scalable. You have to have a process to automate that. And today's day and age, there's no excuse not to. The cost is very affordable. In most cases, it's free, right, for open source projects to have those automated builds. And write your tests up front too. Now, this is something that I'm not, since I was very disciplined about it when I was consulting and writing projects for customers. In writing demo apps, it feels it's probably a good practice to do because we should show what good coding is. But I have to say that's the one part that I probably sacrifice the most in a time crunch. Like I'll focus on automation even over writing those tests because I have something tangible and tactile that I can interact with, and I can always test the end product, especially for the smaller one-off projects. But those are the things I think are important. Understand your infrastructure and build as much automation, especially infrastructure automation upfront as possible. So it becomes just part of your flow and cycle. It doesn't become this thing where the project 6 months in becomes this huge complex project, and then you're trying to tackle this beast and you suddenly have to halt development because you're scrambling to figure out how to build this deployment pipeline. Okay.
Well, you advise a lot on Azure DevOps Services, and one of the questions that I see a lot of developers asking is, do I set up my Visual Studio solution first and the first feature and the application structure and sling a bunch of code and get that skeleton set up right? Or do I set up Azure DevOps Services first somehow? And so let's bring in Azure DevOps into the mix. What should people think about there?
You need something, right, to deploy. So I think it's totally feasible to set up Azure DevOps Services first. They have skeleton projects that you can use to then iterate your code base off of. I personally tend to tackle the project first, but it's not a question of tackling the entire project. It's a question of I build the project and remove some of the boilerplate from the template, and then I'm automating right there. So I'm adding it very early in the process because it is actually beneficial from a perspective of building the code to start to have that immediate feedback. It's really easy to get it to build on your machine. It's not as easy to have it build in a clean environment when you start to bring in dependencies. So having that up front means the instant you add that third-party library that might cause a problem, you get that feedback immediately and you can address it and figure out the right way to stage and deploy that component.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, what's new? What's new in Azure DevOps in general? I mean, there's a lot of talk on GitHub Actions, but I think it's a year and a half ago, VSTS became Azure DevOps.
Right. Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. So I was here long enough to install Visual Source Safe on premise.
Yeah.
Then migrate to Team Foundation System. And then some people, I don't think even remember it was Visual Studio Online, which is now a completely different product today, if that's not interesting enough. But, there are features being added constantly. What I love about the Azure DevOps product is that they dog food their own philosophy and their own tools. So Azure DevOps is what deploys Azure DevOps, which is pretty cool, but it means that there's releases coming out. They're using things like feature flags so that the version that I look at in the portal already has 15 different features in development available. They're just not lit up. So because they're not ready for me to interact with. But, as far as what's new, I think the visual tools for building the pipelines are pretty powerful, and those continue to evolve. The list of widgets, I love my colleague Abel Wang, who is just the ultimate wizard of DevOps and the one I go to when I need help or feedback. He talks about there are a ton of built-in steps that you can use to kind of Lego pieces to put your build pipeline together. If you don't have it out of the box, there's this massive marketplace of widgets, and then you can build your own. And I have yet to encounter a situation where the combination of the three doesn't address what's needed. But, for me, I'll give you just a simple example. My blog is a static blog. I use something called Hugo. And it's called Hugo because it's based on the Go language. That's their templating engine. But I basically write a bunch of Markdown, and then there's a process that parses the Markdown, turns it into static HTML files, and it's deployed. So that is a open source blog. Anyone can see. They can see the drafts of articles that I'm working on, see what's coming down the pipe because I just have it out there in an open repo. But every time I check in, it goes out and does a build, takes in, deploys it to a storage account. That's my static website. When I started the process, there was no native support for Hugo. So it was basically, I could have set up a Unix machine and downloaded the Hugo package, built it, configured it, installed it, made those steps. I decided to go with a containerized approach. So with that container, I just keep a fresh container image and pull down that container to build. But now there's actually a Hugo step that's available for the build pipeline. And so what I'm going to be able to do is swap over to that step. And then instead of having to build a new container when I want a new version of Hugo, I just change an attribute in the pipeline and we're ready to go. So it's small things like that I think make a big deal. Now I did, for my most recent project that I'm talking about, I said, okay, GitHub Actions. This is something new that's coming out, and let me see if I can flex my muscles over here. So I took my most recent project and did my very first GitHub Actions. I actually had my first successful build and deploy yesterday.
Oh, congratulations!
how fresh it is. I mean, you only have so much time, right? So
Right.
all these new things come out. It's like, what am I going to dive down? But this was a pretty simple one. This was a static website. So it was basically staging the files for the static website and then deploying them to storage. But what's nice is that YAML format that is used to define the GitHub Actions is very similar to the Azure pipelines. In fact, I leaned heavily on existing art, if you will, from previous projects to plug that into place. And probably, I mean, it was straightforward to me. It is like keying things in, but you get IntelliSense and you have widgets to pull from. The most complicated step of the process was creating a service principal and storing the secret. And even that was straightforward. It was right there in the docs. Here's the command to create the principal. Here's what you grab. Here's where you put the secret in GitHub, and you're good to go.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
Hey, this is Jeffrey. Do you ever wonder if your software project is on the right path? It's really common for software projects to experience delays, to have the quality not where it needs to be, or have the team spending more time maintaining the software than you really should. In my practice, we know the challenges implementing all parts of DevOps, and it can make your head spin how many things you have to think about, and somewhere in your gut, you know that something's missing. So I've created a comprehensive 30-point DevOps inspection, reviewing your current process, methods, tools, source control, build integration, the various levels of testing, provisioning and maintaining environments, deploying, logging, telemetry, everything you need to think about in a high throughput, high productivity DevOps environment. And it really helps you gain peace of mind knowing that you're on the right track. And we are offering some more of our really popular 30-point DevOps inspections, and it's normally a $5,000 value, but I'm giving it away for free for my podcast listeners. Just send me an email, jeffrey@clear-measure.com. That's Jeffrey. And I'd be happy to inspect your existing DevOps environment, whether you use Azure DevOps Services, Octopus Deploy, TeamCity, any number of tools, because there are a lot out there. But what's important is that you have a complete and automated DevOps environment put together the right way. So get a second pair of eyes. Send me an email. GitHub Actions, it looks like it may end up being a first-class citizen right there as a sister to Azure Pipelines. I mean, it looks like it's like, oh, pick one or the other, as opposed to, oh, put these two together. How is it? How are you guys thinking about that?
So I'm not officially on the DevOps team, so I don't have as much insight into forward thinking. My understanding is that it's a unified approach. And there's not going to be any loss of support for those who have the full usage of Azure DevOps, which Azure DevOps is so much more than the pipelines, right? There's the stories, and there's the test configuration, and there's just a lot. There's, using it as source control repository. But I think that the GitHub Actions gives this first-class continuous integration capability at GitHub. And that was probably the most significant thing for me. Is in my other projects, I've got GitHub open over here. I've got my Azure DevOps open over here, and I'm kind of building between the two. With this most recent project, everything is just right there, lives right within the project, and checks off and kicks off. And I think that marrying the two architectures, which again, I don't have some special insight. I'm assuming that ultimately they're going to be interchangeable. Only benefits everyone, because then you have this plethora of existing modules and steps and pre-existing ways to configure your pipeline that you can draw from. So the one thing that I was missing is the build step felt very similar when I was creating that, but the deployment step is, if anyone's familiar with Azure DevOps, there's just such a rich graphical interface and the ability to have parallel deployments and gates that do things like I can have a system that deploys something to staging, runs performance testing, takes in instrumentation from application insights, and uses that to block deploying it beyond that stage if it's not meeting. There's so much there. My understanding is you can do similar things with GitHub Actions, but I don't think the UI is there yet to help provide that experience. At the end of the day, some people just love YAML, I guess, but I'm a big fan of visualizing the process and the workflow and being able to drill in from that perspective.
Right. So with GitHub Actions, regardless of the format, what's the experience like when you have a packaged up build that you have your release candidate and now you're deploying to environment 1, environment 2, all the way up to production? Is it just a string of actions that are pieced together, or is it more stronger at build than deployment?
That's a great question, and that's the piece that I have not dug into sufficiently yet.
Okay.
I have looked at some other GitHub Actions and seen some more orchestrated. The concepts are very similar. I'm very is pedantic the right word? I'm trying to throw fancy words.
It's a word.
Exactly. I'm very focused on the separation between the build and the deploy. I'll give you an example. I'm not creating new storage accounts for every demo app that I build. I have one storage account and I have subdirectories. What that means is for single page applications, you have to update the base URL because everything has to be relative from that subdirectory or things break. So what I'll do is my build will be a pure build with base href is root. And then it's the deployment process, because this is what's going to change my environment, is the one that will go in and find that and replace that and make that a path. And I was able to easily do that step because of this concept of artifacts. So you can build one-to-end artifacts. So you can have multiple steps. They can run in parallel in GitHub Actions. You can have artifact A, B, and C. And then when you come to the section of your code, which is really just another set of job steps, but your intent is different, then you can take those artifacts and perform steps. Like in mine, it's as simple as a blob copy, right, to storage. But it could be a publish step, and then something that interfaces with app service or serverless, function apps or whatnot.
Yeah.
So my understanding is the capabilities are there to have the multiple streams. I just haven't done it myself. I literally, at the beginning of this week, said I really have to start to learn GitHub Actions. So this project is the one I'll start to learn it from.
Gotcha. Now, when deploying, you're probably still using Azure ARM templates. Is that right? Or do you use a mix of things to provision your actual infrastructure?
So I would use Azure ARM templates. In this case, I don't have a staging. I'm going direct. This is just a demo app for a presentation. So if it breaks, I have a few people, it's broken, I fix it. But so I'm not doing that. But ARM is definitely my preferred way to go. ARM is something, by the way, I'm glad you brought that up, because I wasn't as familiar with ARM when I joined Microsoft. I was used to kind of pre-setting up environments and then deploying to them and not having the infrastructure stood up as part of that pipeline process. What really changed this is I had this amazing opportunity, and I kind of, you add ops to anything these days, right? Someone had a thread on Twitter of, what can I add ops to the end of my title now to beef up my resume? And I almost want to say we have like demo ops or conference ops. Like the new thing for me is, as I build new talks and have demos, I want those demos to be automated, but also automatically deployable. So when you are looking at a presentation I did, instead of me having a bunch of steps, create this web service, create this database, I want to give you a button on my repo that I push. And I learned that from doing something called Microsoft Ignite the Tour. So we have this major conference called Microsoft Ignite. And for the past couple years, we've been taking it on the road. So there's all these tour stops. And we have these sessions that are learning paths that progressively build on each other. But the idea was to scale, to have speakers all around the world, but consistent sessions. You're going to have speakers that are taking on sessions they didn't write themselves. And so we came up with this idea of train the trainer content. And the idea is I'm taking on session X. I have everything I need. What I see is I have a repo with step-by-step instructions. I have a button that will deploy the assets that I need. And then I have a set of videos that were recorded so I can see how the demos are supposed to work and whatnot. But anyone with some familiarity with that topic should be able to pick it up. By forcing us to do that, I had to build some pretty insane ARM templates. I have a module that basically does some automation of image captioning. So as an image is uploaded to blob storage, there's a event that's sent, that event is picked up. A logic app goes out and talks to cognitive services, asks it, can you look at this picture and give me a caption, updates the metadata. So all these things are happening. And this is something that's provisioned with one click through an ARM template. So that template is very, has a lot of dependencies within it. But I was amazed when I was forced to drill into it and automate it as fully as I could at just how much was available there, to the extent that a logic app uses something called a connector, right, to hold authentication information. So for example, for Twitter authorization, I can authorize Twitter with the account. That connector will hold on to the credentials, and then the logic app just works with that Twitter connection. So for cognitive services, I was able to provision the cognitive services instance, and then that has keys that are automatically generated that are secrets. But the ARM template's sophisticated enough, I can say, here's a logic app that's dependent on this connector to cognitive services. That connector is dependent on the cognitive services service being created, and automatically pulls in the keys from the creation of that service. So there's no manual step. You click, you deploy, and everything is automatically integrated and ready to run. And that opened my eyes to, wow, there is so much you can do just through this declarative template that you can check into and out of source control, track changes, and do everything with that. And so it's doing everything from posting push notifications to mobile devices with a simple set of variables that someone can update to their own secret for their device. So having learned that, the first thing was when I first approached this a couple of years back, I'm like, oh my gosh, all this overhead, all this extra work. But then after I saw the final result and actually took on the first talk that I hadn't built myself, I'm going off someone else's talk, and it was so easy. There was a deployment script beyond what I even wrote that you would click the deployment script and it would automatically provision a SQL server, a Cosmos DB, an app service, a set of APIs, a load balancer front end, and even populate and seed the database data. Literally at the end of the deploy process, I have a database seeded with data.
Nice.
And that was just like, wow. So I started looking at my own non-Microsoft Ignite the Tour talks and conferences and said, you know what, I'm going to set a goal to automate as much as possible and make it as easy for anyone to take this and use it and deploy it and work with it. And the pilot project I did for that is a Blazor sort of workshop, if you will, that has a bunch of different Blazor examples. And that project, because it's fully automated, it's easy to pull down, it's auto deployed. So when I upgrade to the latest version, it's automatically pushed out. And you can see that has had the most activity as far as stars and forks and anything from any other repo. And I think a big part of it is because it's just so easy to get started with.
Yeah. Well, it's ease of getting started. I remember earlier in my career, I thought, why would so many people use PHP to create these really complicated web applications? Well, guess what? The getting started story, it was just drop dead simple to do the first thing.
Right.
And it works. It works for getting people started. So
it does. Yeah, it's actually just a quick piece of random trivia, nostalgia, history, if you will. I joined a consulting company to be a Silverlight consultant. Mm-hmm. And the very first project that they gave me was a PHP project. They said, we saw, and I had written like some obscure website years before on PHP. So of course that went on. Yeah. We see you did PHP. Here's this PHP project. And it was a project written in PHP, but with Silverlight to show how Silverlight plays well with open source technology. But right. I thought it was funny that you mentioned that, because it was really easy to get started with that PHP project. But right. Then the complexity set in.
You hit a brick wall for all the back-end stuff.
Yeah, it was a fun experience, to say the least.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks. As we close up, we've talked about DevOps Automation, Azure DevOps, GitHub Actions, ARM templates. For people who want to kind of dig in more, are there any go-to resources that you would point the listeners to?
Good question. I blog about most of the things that I do. So my blog, it's pretty creative. The name I came up with, it's blog.jeremylikness.com. So if you can spell my name from the show notes, you can access the blog. But I try to not just write about the projects that I make, but also how I automate the projects that I make. Outside of that, my big go-to resource for ARM templates is docs.microsoft.com. I can't say enough about this, and I have a selfish motive for this, of course. But one is, I believe that if you go to docs.microsoft.com, look up ARM templates, you're going to find a wealth of information. But two is, if you hit a roadblock, if you're listening to this and you find a stumbling block or find some improvement, this is part of my job. Reach out to me. Let me know how I can help make those docs better. My goal would be, if you ask me anything about Microsoft resource, Azure DevOps pipelines, that I can point you to a Microsoft document that's there. And it's not just, this is the official documentation, I can't read this, but it's, wow, this documentation works and has great examples. And that's one of the things that I love, especially if you go to docs.microsoft.com/learn. I'm not sure if people are familiar with Learn, but that sets up a sandbox in Azure. So even if you don't have an Azure subscription or your own account, it can step you through things like you can create an app service, you can deploy an app, and do all these steps right from within the documentation. So I'm a huge fan of that capability.
Awesome. And where can people get in touch with you?
Best way is on Twitter, at Jeremy Likness on Twitter, but you can also feel free to email me. I am just first name dot last name at Microsoft.com, Jeremy.Likness at Microsoft.com. But Twitter, I've opened direct messages, which means if I'm not following you yet, I can still receive requests, and I respond to all requests that aren't rude or off topic. So.
Nice. Awesome. Hey, well, thanks, Jeremy. This has been really awesome. I've learned a lot, and I appreciate you taking the time and coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Great. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.